for his expertise on what's going on now in contemporary Cambodia. And one thing that has always impressed me about him is his ability to sort of speak, what we call speak truth to power. He's very honest, and he really, I believe, tells the truth as far as he can determine what it is. And that's sometimes a really scary thing to do, especially if you're inside Cambodia. So he's also an expert in political economy, which is very, very important as well. Then we have our other guest, who is also, of course, really well known. She has written what I call a testimonial memoir, which is part of a genre that has grown out of the experience of the Pol Pot era. And in her case, she was a small child during that time. And it was daughter of the killing fields that she wrote about her experience during and after the Khmer Rouge era. She's also Cambodian-American, involved with Cambodian-American human rights, an activist, and a lawyer. So she has a particularly deep and rich perspective to offer about her experience and how she perceives the situation now in Cambodia, which many of us believe is very, very critical. In the panel 2 days ago with the Cambodian poets, the audience was in tears as well as the poets when they were explaining one of the poems about raining in the wrong place. And I think for many younger intellectual Cambodians, what's happening right now in Cambodia is sort of a disappointment, a loss of hope in the sense of the possibility of Cambodia becoming a democracy. So there's a sense of grief about the current situation in Cambodia, and I'm hoping that maybe our panelists can elaborate what that means, if they perceive that there may be a change in a more positive direction or not. So I'm hoping for a very realistic and truthful discussion, which is sometimes difficult and painful to do. So, ladies first.
Where to start? And we'll have some time with the audience as well, right, in terms of an exchange, because it would be interesting to hear where your interests lie or curiosity is in all of this. I live and work in Cambodia, and I've done this since 1995 when I returned to the country. I was born there, but then I moved to the United States as a refugee and did all my education there. So I've seen the development of the country from 1995 until now. And there was a lot of hope, because in 1995, it was only after 3 years, only 2 years, when I got there, the United Nations had been in the country in 1993, 2 years earlier. So there was a lot of hope. And that was when the elections took place. That was when the UN introduced, let's say, democracy to the country. And the people went out in full force despite the killings and the intimidation. They went out in the 90th percentile and voted. And they voted for change. And the current prime minister lost, but he wiggled himself back into power and now became again prime minister. And as you know, our current prime minister, Mr. Hun Sen, was a former Khmer Rouge. So this is, and then we have the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. So imagine the Khmer Rouge Tribunal trying to try the crimes of the Khmer Rouge with the head of the government being a former Khmer Rouge. So how that works out, you can decide. So for me, it is a grieving period now, and I can't say that I've lost all hope, because then I wouldn't be able to exist in Cambodia. But we're in a very, very difficult, challenging time with a one-party rule. So all the efforts that have been done, all the strides that we have made since the United Nations entered Cambodia in 1993, with the largest UN presence at that time in the history of the world, with a $2.4 billion budget, again, unprecedented at that time, and now we're back almost to square one. So you can imagine, for me to have been there in 1995 until now, to have seen the progress, to have worked toward the contribution to the contribution of this progress, and now to be in this state of affairs. So it's to say that it's disheartening and challenging and disturbing. Is to really is to put it to put it mildly. So I guess I can go on, but I think so. Paul probably wants to say something too.
Well, thank you everybody for for being here. I want to take a step back because I think we haven't actually heard necessarily the history of the country, the contemporary history of the country, and maybe folks who don't know what the Khmer Rouge are. So I think I'll start with a little bit more history. I was born in 1974, a year before the Khmer Rouge took power. So Cambodia had been neutral during most of the Vietnam War, but in 1970 there was a coup d'état that brought a government in that supported the United States. So from 1970 until 1975, there was a government called the Khmer Republic, which was pro-US. And from 1975 to 1979, it was a Khmer Rouge regime. So Khmer Rouge means red Cambodians. They were Marxist, communist in their ideology. They followed Chinese Maoism and initially were friendly with Vietnamese communists. Then they turned against the Vietnamese communists. So in the case of my family, everyone in the capital city, so Phnom Penh was full of refugees at that point. People from the rural areas were moved into the capital city, and then when the Khmer Rouge won on April 17, 1975, they told everybody to leave Phnom Penh. They said that there would be US bombs dropped on the country. So at that point, people are actually celebrating, happy that the war has ended because one side won, the Khmer Rouge won. And so they followed the advice, which is only a few days. You're going to leave the capital city. You're going to go into the countryside to be safe from US bombs. Of course, that was a lie, and it turned into a nightmare for these 2 million people. My family was sent to Pursat province. 5 kids, including myself, my father and mother. And by 1976, the Khmer Rouge announced that they would allow Vietnamese citizens to return to Vietnam. This was before they started going to war against Vietnam, so they were very busy consolidating power. And so my mother spoke some Vietnamese. She agreed with my father that we were going to pretend to be Vietnamese, even though he didn't speak any Vietnamese. And remember, at this point, there's no such thing as a passport that will let you through up the border. You essentially have to speak the language and prove that you are from a certain place to be able to go to that place. My mother learned some Vietnamese as a child, having Vietnamese friends, going to markets where there's a lot of sellers that spoke the language. And so she took that chance. My father didn't speak any. 3 days into the journey, he passes away, which I think in some ways was merciful and fated, because what would have happened once he was tested? He would have failed. And then what we saw happen apparently was that husbands and wives, whoever passed could go to Vietnam, whoever failed had to stay, or they could all stay and essentially die together. So my mother is tested twice. She's able to go, it's a long story, but her Vietnamese was so bad, she gave all the kids new names. So the boys needed to have Vietnamese names, the girls needed to have Vietnamese names, but her Vietnamese was so bad that she gave the boys girls' names and the girls' boys' names. And then somebody explained to her, you have to change that because it's wrong. And it was an auntie that essentially was like a drill sergeant for 3 days, tutoring her in Vietnamese to be able to pass the exam, the language exam. And from there, we were able to go to Vietnam, be safe from the Khmer Rouge, but Vietnam by then had become a communist country. And so my mother, of course, being the smart woman she was, then said, we are not Vietnamese, we're Cambodians. So as a result, we were able to then say that we could leave Vietnam, because if you're a Vietnamese citizen under the communists, you cannot leave Vietnam. You have to have permission to leave, and they're not giving permission to anybody. So she's able to talk her way into becoming Cambodian again, and then we found family in France that was able to help us. There was a Frenchman who helped sponsor our family. He was found randomly, apparently bumped into a cousin of mine, and he decided to help. They needed to find a family with the same last name as my mother's to help sponsor her, and so he looked in the phone book, found somebody with the same last name, and was able to sponsor her. So really very fortunate that people were able to help us along the way. It's a little bit of the story of Cambodia. Most of the Cambodian refugees went through Thailand. My wife, for example, she escaped through Thailand, very standard route that millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, fled to, and eventually resettled. Some of them were resettled into third countries. But the Khmer Rouge, what did they do? They killed 1.7 million people, 25% of the population, in 4 years. The country was 6 to 7 million people. They did a lot of damage. And if you think about what war represents, war is development in reverse. It is the opposite of development. It's the destruction of your productive capacity, and the Khmer Rouge did that very well. The Vietnamese then invaded Cambodia in 1979, January 7th, 1979, kicking out the Khmer Rouge to the border with Thailand. Hun Sen, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, who was former Khmer Rouge, is one of the leaders of that group that takes over the country. And for the next decade, Vietnam occupies Cambodia, which then becomes an issue of geopolitics, because who is the patron of Vietnam in the 1980s? It's the Soviet Union. And who is the enemy of the Soviet Union? It's the United States. So therefore, the United States supports the Khmer Rouge during the 1980s to retain Cambodia's seat at the UN in order to prevent the Soviet Union from controlling Cambodia's seat through Vietnam. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense, but a genocidal regime was allowed to continue holding Cambodia's seat at the United Nations. So the work that I've done, this research that I do, which is on aid dependence in Cambodia, for example, this is work that's about foreign aid and its impact, upside down, on Cambodia. How foreign aid has hurt the country, and I think generally speaking, when a country, one of the things I calculated in the book is when a country receives, for every dollar that it spends on its government budget, if it receives 94.3 cents, so almost 1 to $1 in foreign aid, that's a lot of foreign aid, and that can really create dependence on an external source of funding. That was the problem for Cambodia for most of the 1990s, and then for much of the first decade of the 2000s. Now, of course, Cambodia relies a lot on China, which is a very different story in terms of how much they ask for accountability or for democracy, which China does not care about democracy, or human rights, which China, of course, is not a great champion of human rights either. But that has led to all kinds of implications as a result. And based on what Terry just said about the trajectory of Cambodia in the present, it's essentially been that from 1993 to 2000 and I'd say 16, 17, you had sort of a little bit of democracy, you had the veneer of democracy, and as of 2018, 2019, it has been completely washed away, destroyed, and turned into I would say a country that does no longer, it was just rated yesterday by Freedom House as not free. And so it's a very sad story. It's a story where billions of dollars were spent for a country's democratic hopes to prevent the return of the Khmer Rouge, to prevent the kind of genocidal outcome that happened in the 1970s. And instead, you have exactly the same people who were in power in the 1980s, 1990s, 2010s, and today. 34 years of the same prime minister is, I think, probably a little too long to stay in power. It creates a lack of accountability. Nobody can say no to you. It's really problematic. But anyway, I think I've spoken too much, so we should go on with other questions.
So before we open the floor up to your questions, I just wanted to relate very quickly the impact of this change away from democracy on contemporary writers. And since I am associated with the New Hutch Literary Association, which was formed about 20 years ago to support young writers, to get their works published. And nearly every year we have had a literary conference, sort of like this one, but not with so many people. You know, it was maybe we could have an audience of about 500 altogether. We would give some literary awards for short fiction and for poetry. And it was a pretty successful experience, and then we would publish those award-winning poems and short stories, and we would do English translations to the best of our ability. So we did altogether about 8 years worth of those journals, and they were the only literary journals published in Cambodia. So this was and we would invite writers from Australia, the United States. One year we invited K.S. Maniam from Malaysia to come and give writers' workshops or poetry workshops. So that, because there's no writers' programs, creative writing programs in Cambodia. So we were always able to do, every year, do a conference, do an event. I never filed. We did file as an NGO initially, but I never, all the NGOs, I don't know, it was about 5 years ago, had to refile. Had to completely refile as an NGO and do a bunch of paperwork and be approved. We didn't do that, but it still didn't stop us from organizing an event. Now this year, for the first time, we have sort of writers who grew up through the New Hutch Literary Association starting their own literary festival. They did one, they've done it very successfully with thousands of people showing up for the past couple of years. Now this year, for the first time, they have to submit a petition to have a literary event. And in order to have this literary event, they have to sign off on the fact that there will be absolutely no criticism of the government by anyone or any writer at this event. So that's the first time that that has happened. And of course, it makes one of the young writers who's here at this event is the organizer, and she was talking to me, you know, I'm starting to get really scared, you know, because in Cambodia they will just pick you up off the street and put you in prison, you know, without any recourse. So unfortunately, I feel that the trajectory, the trend is going in a direction of more social control. And that would also mean control of writers as well. Did you have any other comments?
Well, I was going to say that when they pick you up off the street, they're being nice. The truth is a lot of Cambodia's heroes have been killed in recent years. That is not a coincidence. When you have somebody who's very popular, who is criticizing the authorities, who is working for for the environment, for example, they've ended up dead, working for labor rights, unionists, etc. So there's a Khmer term called batsbat, which means broken courage. That's what I think the authorities are very expert at doing, to essentially break the courage, break the spirit of people. so that they will not rise again. And in a country that's had 25% of its population killed, it's a serious threat, because they're essentially alluding to the possibility of a return to violence. And who exactly would have the guns? Well, it's the authorities that have the guns. So it's very strange that they would blame somebody else for causing violence when they're the only ones who have all the guns. But anyhow.
On the topic of violence and basbat, of broken spirit or broken courage, yes, it is true that it has impact on the population, but I have to say, I have to speak to the spirit of the population. They are strong, despite of course, when that type of when that type of environment exists, the element of fear is that, but they may not be able to speak now, but that doesn't mean that their spirit has been broken, despite the attempt, time and again. And I can tell you, with regards to these heroes that have been slain in broad daylight, many of them were friends of mine. I remember Tun Bun Lee. He was the editor of of an opposition newspaper. In 1995, my godparents came to visit me in Cambodia from Michigan. He became our tour guide. We went to a village just on the outskirts of Phnom Penh, but we had to go through many checkpoints. And of course, my godparents had never met them, and he spoke a broken English. And he said, I told them who he is, and of course they should be scared, but they're just going along with this, visiting me in Cambodia in 1995. And then Tumuli said, and my godfather asked him, "Aren't you afraid?" How can you be afraid? 1 month later, he was killed in broad daylight. So that was the editor of an opposition paper. Another famous, the union leader, was a very good friend of mine. When I went to Cambodia in 1995, I was involved in the labor movement. It was in 97, because President Clinton had just given most favored nation status, and it was mushrooming. And so you have all these rural young people, mainly women, coming into the city, and there were no labor standards. And so Chiu grew up to lead the free trade union, and I was helping out with English and all of that. And he was slain in broad daylight. Every year now we commemorate his death and his assassination. But about several years ago, in 2012, I believe, there was a ban on public congregating of more than 9 people. Because the day before, they arrested 9 people who had been marching to demand the arrest of activists who had been detained in prior days, and they detained that. And so I turned to Moni, I called him up, I said, "Moni, tomorrow's your brother's anniversary. I know we can't do this. I mean, there's a ban, but we need to do this. We need to challenge the ban," and we did it. And about 300 or 400 people showed up to commemorate Chibuchi's assassination. Another one is Kam Lay, again, very popular radio spokesperson, a friend, a colleague in the human rights field, slain in broad daylight. And it's the type of slaying, the type of assassination where they leave all the clues there because they want everyone to know that it's done by the government without, and then disclaiming that it's them. But they want to send the message that it can be done. So a lot of daylight assassinations to send a message. But the courage is still there, and the spirit of resistance is still there. And for many of our demonstrations, and prior to the election of 2013, there were massive demonstrations, and prior to that, we showed a lot of videos of Gandhi and the nonviolent marches, because we really wanted to say, look, it has happened before, and nonviolence is the way. So we took a lot of inspiration from your history.
I'll just add that Kam Lay's murderer was on camera after being caught, and said his name was Chuop Sam Lap, which in Cambodian means meat killed, which I think he was told to say because it was literally a kind of message to anyone watching that if you meet him, you will die. Of course, he had a whole cover story about Kam Lay borrowing money from him and not paying, and that's why he killed him. And in so many cases, I had a friend, Ratsadi, who was killed. The cover there was his phone was stolen, but it's very interesting. 2 guys go to him at a restaurant, shoot him dead, are about to leave, then come back and take his phone so that it can be blamed for cell phone theft. Of course, the fact that they forgot about taking it and then came back to take it means that, you know, they weren't actually thinking about doing that. But yeah, I think these are all messages. I know people are still. There's a Khmer saying that when the wind blows, you have to you can lay low, and that's what's happening right now. There's a sense that, okay, well, if the wind is blowing strongly, you're not going to stand up and start fighting against the wind. You have to essentially take cover, and when things calm down, it doesn't mean that you've forgotten who you are or are no longer a believer in democracy and human rights. It just means that at this moment, it's probably better not to stick your head out and end up shot as a result of that.
So I think now we'll open the discussion up to audience questions. So let me come down here. Yeah. Okay.
Is there any question?
Many things are, you have spoken very clearly about the past of Cambodia, but for me it's not yet very clear. Like the Khmer Rouge regime, they kill people, persecuted people for what reason? Because the people were opposing them, that's why. Is that the thing?
Why did they kill is the topic of an entire book by Alex Hinton. The Khmer Rouge, they had a vision of society that was radical. If you've ever heard the John Lennon song Imagine, the lyrics actually talk about no money, no religion, and that's what the Khmer Rouge did. They banned money. So even before they took over Phnom Penh, they had started printing money because they were planning to be more like a normal country where you use money. But then at the last moment, they decided we're not going to use money. So from 1975 until 1979, they banned the use of money. There was no money being used. The central bank, the Reserve Bank of India equivalent, was blown up. And that is the first message that your money is worth nothing to us because we don't care about money. And you will go and be slave labor in these camps to grow rice, build dams, build airport runways, and so on. Projects that, first of all, the people were completely, not trained to do, but essentially to then take that and develop the nation with this very strange vision, which was based on agrarian development. They had this vision where they would return back to Angkorian times. So Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu monument in the world, they remembered that during Angkor times there were multiple harvests of rice. So they thought we're going to do the same thing, but they were not agronomists. They were not able to do or achieve these things, and in the process, they broke a lot of eggs, by which I mean killed a lot of people, and that has been, I think, the marked reason. Now, did they intend to? Of course, they felt that, the people like my family, we were known as the new people when we arrived in the countryside. The new people versus the old people. The old people being people who came from that village, who were already living in that village. And so the social structure was basically new people versus old people, with the old people being senior to the new people. And then food allocations being porridge every day, barely any grains of rice. Your only possession is a spoon. You don't own anything. This is the abolishment of private property. Maybe a paradise in some views, but disastrous in the real economy.
But they were communists, weren't they?
Yes. Well, the ideology was communist, but if you read Marx, you have to first go through an industrial revolution, and then you will reach your communist paradise. Instead, Cambodia was not industrial, so how are you going to get there? You have to go through an agrarian revolution, and of course that was why they forced people to grow the rice and make it, try to produce as much as possible and export it, which only, of course, at the time China would buy, and some communist countries would buy from Cambodia, and most of it was obviously it's you're not functioning as part of a world economy. You're functioning as part of a communist brotherhood of countries.
If you only read one book on Cambodia, I would recommend Pol Pot by Philip Short, or When the War Was Over by Elizabeth Becker. That gives you, I mean, for me, it's a good introduction to the recent past and the current situation. So Pol Pot is the biography of the leader of the Khmer Rouge by Philip Short, who was also the biographer of Mao Zedong. And as you know, the Khmer Rouge, China was the patron of the Khmer Rouge. And now it's like a return to the Cold War, because China is again back in Cambodia. And all the geopolitical factors of the 70s are in play again, but with globalization, internet, and everything else. So When the War Was Over by Elizabeth Becker, a journalist, or Pol Pot by Philip Short, both journalists. So it reads really well because they're journalists, so they're engaging. It's a history book, but it's very engaging and it's very it's accessible.
I think one thing that we didn't clarify, and I'm not sure that everybody knows, but when in 1975, when Phnom Penh fell, everybody, all the citizens of Phnom Penh essentially were forced to leave the city. The entire city was evacuated, forced evacuation. So those were the new people. And they ended up in various rural areas, in malarial forests, digging, working in rice fields, digging dams. It's really hard to understand this logically. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But the ultimate, the end of this is also the deconstruction of the infrastructure. They took apart electrical generators. They took apart the Royal University of Phnom Penh, the science labs. The library is gone. So it's not just killing intellectuals, but it's also destroying the infrastructure. And Cambodia today is still it doesn't have the kind of infrastructure that it really needs to develop in the way that it should. I do some research in Phnom Penh, and there's an area called Diamond Island, which has now become a mega city with a lot of Chinese investment and huge buildings and condominiums. They have already had to replace the water piping because they didn't put it in the right way the first time. There's no sewage that is going to be effective. There's still a huge infrastructure problem.
To your question, why did they kill? So I guess I'll give you an indirect answer by just giving a very brief outline. So Cambodia gained independence in 1953, November, from the French, briefly the Japanese, and then independence. And then we have internal instability. And then we have the coup in 1970. But Cambodia was always a sideshow of Vietnam because Cambodia borders Vietnam. So there's the US presence and then the US fear of the domino effects of communism, one country falling to communism and then another, then another. So I'm going to give you figures of deaths and population just to give you a sense of the challenge that is facing us now. The US bombed Cambodia from 1969 to 1973 at 500,000 tons of bombs, more bombs dropped on Cambodia, neutral officially, during the war with Vietnam than any country in the world at that time, even Japan, its sworn enemy of World War II, for example. So that's from 69 to 73. I was born, I don't know exactly, I think January 1971. I was born into the bombs that were being dropped into Phnom Penh and everywhere in Cambodia. There were craters everywhere across the country. Then the Khmer Rouge came in 75. So 2 years later, after the U.S., when the U.S. Senate ordered the bombings to stop, 2 years later, the Khmer Rouge emerged. This ragtag band of guerrilla communists, all of a sudden, were given power and a ready population. Because the villages were destroyed within a blink of an eye, and it was easy. And the villages became easy recruitments, as you can imagine, from the U.S. bombings. And then the Khmer Rouge for 4 years, and then occupation for at least 10 years. For me, 13 years with others. So it's Vietnamese military presence. So here's the deaths in the population. In 1975, we had a population of 7 million. The Khmer Rouge killed 1.7 million. The U.S. bombings, we don't know exactly the number of deaths. Probably at least 500,000 deaths. 500,000 deaths, at least from the U.S. bombings. And then 1.7 million just a few years later, in 1975 to 79. And then during military occupation alone, only in 1979, 700,000 died under Vietnamese military and occupation immediately after the Khmer Rouge. And then all the other deaths of other types of whenever you live under military occupation, and there was also, it was sealed. But not a lot has been talked about this. And then now we have the current leader who has been with the Khmer Rouge, who has been with the Vietnamese military occupiers, and who have been propped up by them, now continue to rule. So this is the challenge that is facing us. And now we have the presence of China again, a return to the situation of the 70s, but in modern times. So that's the challenge facing us at the moment.
So as part of the discussion of the topic, Cambodia, past, present, and future, we've got to hear a lot about the past. And what do you think? What does the future hold? And, what is the present situation like, Since you have the same thing, it's like, coming back again. So...
Well, it's tough. I'm there. And I'm part of being there. People are always saying, aren't you fearful? Well, you can't live in fear because that's paralyzing. Of course, I don't walk in front of a moving...
you can talk freely about if you talk
people are a little bit
against
surprised
the
that I can, and I have. I'm vocally, I have imprints all online, and they're very transparent and they're very public. But for whatever reason, I don't want to address the issues too much. But I know that I'm monitored. It used to be worse than this, but now it's more. The monitoring is becoming more and more intense. I feel it, and they have shown it. Online, physical presence. So there's that. But I'm always conscious, that I hold 2 passports. I hold a U.S. passport and a Cambodian passport. I speak English, so that's a layer of protection. But to whatever degree, there's always an issue. But it's either that or go away. I go back to the States, or I do something else. But this is my passion. This is my work, and there's not really an option for me.
What is the present form of government there?
Okay, the present form of government is a constitutional monarchy that has a National Assembly and a Senate, so it's a bicameral legislature, a prime minister. You have political parties that are voted in, not individuals, right? So you vote for the party, and I think it's first past the poll in terms of which party gets it. But the formula used favors large parties, and in the 2018 election, the ruling party essentially arranged for the main opposition party to be made illegal and for the leader of the opposition party to be imprisoned for treason. Of course, it's bogus. Also, there were 2 English language newspapers, the Cambodia Daily and the Phnom Penh Post, and they were both presented with tax bills, overdue tax bills of millions of dollars to be paid within 30 days. So the Cambodia Daily essentially chose, instead of paying, they didn't have the money, but they chose to essentially stop publishing and go online completely. And the Phnom Penh Post, which is regrettable, I think, was instead sold to a Malaysian investor who happened to be the public relations consultant for the prime minister in a previous life, and therefore became essentially captured by the authorities. So now the Phnom Penh Post is more of a government mouthpiece, but people who read it and don't know this only understand that it was an award-winning newspaper for many years, very famous newspaper in Cambodia, and instead it has been captured in that way. It's quite sad. So the future. Before I talk about the future, let me just say one thing about the past. The Khmer Rouge had a saying, and it is well-known saying. It's, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. That is the message of the Khmer Rouge, to essentially say, you are at the margin. You could be gotten rid of, or you could be kept. It doesn't matter to us. This is the mentality of a regime that essentially destroyed or killed a quarter of its population. I mean, they banned books, they banned love, they arranged marriages between 70-year-olds and 20-year-olds, random marriages. I mean, we talk about arranged marriages and mass weddings, you know, ban money, ban property, the kinds of social engineering that you don't see anymore. But yet, I'll tell you, I mean, look, I recognize it as more than just a Cambodian phenomenon. In Peru, for example, the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, the leader there, professor, referred to Pol Pot as a petty bourgeois. So he wanted to create an even more extreme version of Marxism, communism in Peru than what the Khmer Rouge had created. It's, I think, a condition. And the Khmer Rouge talked about Romanian communism as being this 2-horsepower communism, and there the Khmer Rouge would be 100-horsepower communism. So an obsession with metaphors of engines and horsepower and how they were the true, most powerful communists and most dedicated to the implementation of the ideology as possible. But to the idea of what the future holds, certainly the future in Cambodia is not as, I would say, bright. The European Union has announced that it is reviewing everything but arms, the preferential trade agreement that allows Cambodia, a least developed country, to export to the EU duty-free everything but arms, essentially. That is a huge, huge reason for why Cambodia makes so much money. It exports garments, as does Bangladesh, to Europe, and garments are billions and billions of dollars for Cambodia. Now, if that were to be taken away, there would suddenly be, say, a 10% tariff on garments. So you would expect a reduction in the export of garments, and then layoffs as a result, factory closures, things like that. Now, in reaction to this, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, who, because they say EBA comes with a requirement for human rights, respect for human rights and so on. So they're saying, Cambodia, you have not been doing your end of the bargain. You have been destroying human rights and democracy. So the Prime Minister said, if you touch EBA, I will kill the opposition. So instead of understanding that the situation should be remedied, instead of remedying the situation by simply saying, okay, we'll back down, let's be calm about this, to turn it into you really want to play with us? We'll kill the opposition. Of course, what else is there in terms of the opposition? They've already been banned and dissolved. He allowed for the return of some opposition figures if they wrote a letter to him to apologize and to say that he was right and so on. Which is always the same thing. He always needs these letters of apology all the time. But that is a message that I think only two banned opposition figures took up, and the rest have so far not accepted these conditions. So EBA in the very near future could be taken away from Cambodia, and that is a real threat that could lead to economic chaos in the country, which nobody wants to see personally. But frankly, when your toolbox is so limited, what do you have to essentially threaten a country to say, you know what, you have to stop. You have to back down from what you're doing, because you've gone too far, and now you're going to pay the price for doing that.
The future. Well, Faulkner said the past, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And so that is very, very apt with Cambodia. The past is not dead, it's not even past. The past is our present. We're waiting for international and for the EBA to take its effect. Already we see that companies, garment industries and companies are already leaving. So that it's coming. The impact of it is being felt already, but we're waiting for it. We're in the midst of this. We're in the waiting process. Also, the U.S. has been very, very strong. Cambodia the U.S. has been very strong in blacklisting certain individuals, because if the international community threaten Cambodia generally, the leaders could care less because it's not hitting their pockets, it's not hurting them and their family members. But now the U.S. is being strategic and targeting individuals. So the U.S. is also very, very strong regarding this. But the problem is that China is very, very fully present there. It's funding a lot of things. It has military presence there. It has now demographic presence. It owns support. So, of course, China is everywhere. We have been hearing about China, but Cambodia to China is extra special because of the Khmer Rouge history and because of our vulnerability. With one Cambodia stone, China gets Vietnam, it gets the US, and it gets ASEAN. It gets a voice in ASEAN via Cambodia. So it's that type of presence. But we're waiting, so we're in the waiting. But we're hopeful, but it's challenging. Despite having seen the progress, having been in civil society that was very vibrant, having been a part of that vibrancy, and now all of a sudden this regression within a blink of an eye. And so we're in the process right now of waiting for these international sanctions and pressures from the West to take its impact, and we're advocating for that, and we're also communicating with the population. Many people at the leadership level of the opposition are personal friends of mine, so I know them really well, and I know their energy, I know their spirit, so I have a lot of faith, and also they're very active overseas, so we're not silent. It's just we have a huge challenge in front of us.
Thank you.
Does anyone have another question?
Any other question?
Any other questions?
I was just wondering about the situation, health and education. Like, what is happening there? What about schools, colleges? What about this?
Health.
Health and education.
Yeah. Let me just address the health issue, because I was recently, 2 years ago, on a medical mission out to the rural areas. There is a colleague in Long Beach who runs medical missions every year to Cambodia, different rural sites. I would say that there certainly there are new hospitals in Phnom Penh. There's a new Japanese hospital that is a very high quality, but you're going to have to be wealthy if you want any service from this hospital. So it's a very different situation inside of Phnom Penh, and a lot of work could be done to improve medical care for people who are not wealthy, which is a lot of the population in Phnom Penh. And then the wealthier people who can afford either to go to Thailand for better medical care, or they can go to Vietnam. I know that there's a trend now to try to improve at least hospital medical care in Phnom Penh. Now, if you go out to the rural areas, which I did, folks don't have glasses. We gave out hundreds and hundreds of reading glasses. They don't have toothbrushes or toothpaste. I saw really small children with full of cavities. We had a dentist with us, 2 dentists and some dental assistants with us, and they were pulling these children's teeth because there's no dental care. So in the rural areas, it's very sad. On the other hand, there's a wonderful hospital in Siem Reap next to Angkor Wat, but it's private, and the fundraising is quite brilliant for it. So it's kind of mixed. Doctors in public hospitals aren't paid very much, so they end up running their own clinics on the side where they can make money. I was in the public hospital in Battambang Bang and looking at the surgery room, and the equipment was essentially non-existent. So the the medical care, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that. No, I'll pass this on for those who want to talk about education.
Before education, I also want to say something about health. Up until, well, both health and education, up until recently, has been done by civil society and by organizations and volunteers from overseas or from organizations and funding from USAID or other international organizations. So from the government side, nil. The quality is nil. It's been propped up, it's been taken care of by civil society. So here's the danger now. There's no civil society. Well, in the health and education, it's less political, so some of them still exist, but because overall the repressive environment overall is very, very real, it makes the donors very, very tense and reluctant. So, but up until now, it has been done by civil society, by volunteer NGOs, by international aids, not from the government itself. And so there's no infrastructure that is government-based. I mean, those are the two basic government services generally of any functioning state. And we don't have it, we've never had it, really. Due to poor salaries, due to inadequate training, due to corruption, the list goes on. But now it's more dire because civil society, yes, human rights and democracy advocacy, but I think it's impacting in the NGOs and the nonprofits generally, even if it's to a lesser degree.
Yeah, and this morning I was talking to my volunteer about testing, for example, testing for entrance into schools. So in India, you have all these tests, national exams, and so on. In Cambodia, we also have that. But for years, it was plagued by corruption, right? So you could buy the answers, and the teachers would sell the answers, and then you would go in and take the test, and miraculously, you had your great score as a result of this. And I remember a few years ago, there was this story about it. So they buy the exam scores from outside the classroom, but they have to get it inside the classroom. So the friend or sibling of one of the kids taking the exam, wrapped the answer around a rock and threw it into the classroom, and it hit a kid on the head and hurt him, making him bleed. And this is ridiculous. I mean, how can you have a doctor later who's actually not studied at all, but because of cheating ends up being a medical doctor? And would you ever have anything done to your body by this fake doctor, right? I mean, a couple of years ago, there was a paramedical professional in a village in Cambodia who caused, the entire village got HIV/AIDS because he kept reusing the same needle to inject, to save money, I guess, I'm not sure, but he just kept injecting everybody with the same needle, and it spread AIDS throughout the entire village. And people just fainted, hundreds of people. And of course, he's in jail now, but how in this day and age to see something like that? I mean, it's so basic, and yet, healthcare that isn't there. It brings up the challenge that I talk about in my book, which is called the Good Samaritan's Dilemma. What if you have a government that's corrupt, asking for bribes, but you have people who want to help the poor people, the ones who don't have healthcare or education, but you have to go through this government. The dilemma of the Good Samaritan is, do you accept this condition, or do you say, well, you know what, we cannot work under these conditions. We cannot allow the government to essentially take most of the money and leave a little bit for the actual work that we do. But that is the Good Samaritan's dilemma. I think for a lot of Cambodian NGOs, non-governmental organizations, the challenge is, how do you accept having to essentially go through an entity that is highly corrupt, that is not interested in serving its people. Estimates of 10% of GDP corruption. You know, this is so high that I'd say you're not able to buy anything. You can't get a bottled water without the company having some connection with the authorities. Any product that's imported is essentially goes to a gatekeeper that is, the authorities, their families, and so they take a toll each time for you to essentially function in that economy. It's very destructive, and obviously there isn't any hope, I think, at this point of things turning the corner, but perhaps in the future.
Thank you.
If you go to Cambodia today, you wouldn't know that it's a poor country if you only stay in Phnom Penh or Siem Reap, because it's awash with Rolls Royce. It's awash with all these luxury cars. Now I'm seeing Audis that are brand new. I mean, this is the newest brand name in the country. So if those two cities, you wouldn't know that it's a poor country.
Thank you. Any other question?
Can I just speak a little bit about education? Is there other question? I think once again we have a big split between the rural areas and the big cities. In the rural areas, the schools are still quite small. I've been to schools where there's like one chalkboard for 60, 70 students. No textbooks, essentially. Very few textbooks. Very, very few supplies in the rural areas. Teachers are not compensated very much at all. Essentially, those schools have no libraries. We have a young Cambodian American in Long Beach, once again, who has a project to build small libraries in public schools in Cambodia, and he's on his third public library, it's like a wonderful thing to do, but you need more than 3 school libraries. The universities, so I've been going to Cambodia since 1995. And at that point, there was like the Royal University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia. So it felt like just one public university. But since then, there's been a rapid development of private universities, Panyasastra University, and many of these well-developed private universities have been built by Cambodian Americans, by expats who come back to Cambodia and want to do something to help the country, and then maybe become the Prime Minister of Education, which is a true case, and then they become very wealthy. So in a sense, it becomes a pathway for them to become extremely rich. Nevertheless, the educational situation in Phnom Penh is very different and of much higher quality. That doesn't mean that I would be sending my child to medical school there if I were a parent. There's some incredibly good international schools now, but you have to be wealthy to send your children to those schools.
I think we are quite close to our allotted time. I would request you to kindly sum up today's session.
First of all, thank you for your interest in Cambodia. I was told that I'm the first Cambodian that many of you have seen or have met. I've never thought in those terms. I'm glad to be having this interaction to bring the Cambodian situation outside of Cambodia, because we do need external pressure, not only from the West, but from the neighboring countries as well. Because we're in a very, very difficult and challenging period. But the young people are there, the energy is there, the knowledge of what it means to be a Democrat, to have democracy, the yearning is there, the aspiration is there. English is very, very prevalent. So that's the communication of the internet, which is synonymous with Facebook. It's the internet, the language of communication globally, of connection. So there are a lot of other positive things that we haven't addressed, but they are there. And they will come into play given a certain moment in time. So we're waiting for that perfect storm. But the energy and the aspirations and the resistant and the rebellious spirit are definitely there. So that's the hope.
Yeah, so I don't want to leave you depressed and feeling that the country is a complete disaster and a basket case. But yes, obviously, if I felt that way, I wouldn't work on Cambodia. I wouldn't try to make things better. I think one of the primary distinctions one has to understand, the ruling party and the regime have kind of misrepresented the idea that if you criticize what they do, you are anti-patriotic. In fact, I would argue that you are doing your duty as a citizen by pointing out the flaws and the problems so that they can be worked on, as opposed to going with the program and turning a blind eye when there are issues. I would argue that it is, in fact, the highest duty of a citizen to stand up. So much of what happens now in Cambodia is this, if you're familiar with the Roman poet Juvenal, bread and circuses. Giving people higher wages by mandating them, creating circuses in the sense of entertainment through, I mentioned this yesterday in my panel, through the biggest dragon boat, the biggest line dance, the Guinness World Record, biggest rice cake, Cambodian rice cake, all these ridiculous records that the government is trying to achieve to entertain people and make them not think about the real problems that are happening in the country. Well, there are real problems that are happening in the country, and it's our duty, I think, to continue to speak truth to power and to point them out as much as possible, and to with our earnest efforts, improve the country as much as possible.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank each one of you for sharing your insights and sharing your stories, and this discussion was indeed quite an eye-opener. Thank you once again. With these very informative views, we conclude this discussion on Cambodia, past, present and future. We have lined up another interesting session on Mountains Calling, Literature and Society in Tibet. That starts from 3:30 p.m. onwards. Hope to see all of you again. Thanks.